My name is Kokernak. I'm a senior director at the Urban Land Institute and the Randall Lewis Center for Sustainability. My focus at the Urban Land Institute is on thought leadership, and I'm really excited to present today on tenants and owners as co-pilots on the flight to net zero. Just to talk you through what we're going to go through today, in the flight to net zero, I'll start out with an intro and define what I mean by the flight to net zero. It is a bit of an analogy with the flight path and the airport and airplane, but it's a little bit of a fun way to talk through the journey to net zero. Then we'll jump into the runway or industry challenges, specifically around commercial real estate, and then the takeoff, opportunities for tenants and owners as co-pilots and moving along the journey together. And then we'll hit our final destination, which is the intent to be whole building decarbonization. Q&A will be limited to emails or any other way to contact me, and we'll talk through that at the end. So first, I'd like to start a little bit about the mission of the Urban Land Institute. The overall mission for the Urban Land Institute is to shape the future of the built environment for transformative impact in communities worldwide. We're really focused on connecting industry members, inspiring industry members with best practices, reports, convenings, and content, and then leading and solving community and real estate challenges through that collective global experience and engagement. We do have a mission priority at the Urban Land Institute that is net zero. So really focusing on decarbonizing real estate and accelerating our progress to net zero. The ULI decarbonization program does that with three paths. Overall, reducing carbon and building value, but we do that through research and thought leadership. So that's my focus. We're really focused on the business case for green buildings, the business case for ESG, and the overall journey to net zero for the global real estate industry. We also have our Greenprint community of practice. This is a collaborative of, at this point, this is an outdated number because we are over, I think, 134 real estate owners who have committed to improving the performance of buildings and achieving net zero by 2050. So these are real estate developers that are members of our Greenprint community of practice, and they meet on a monthly basis. We have subgroups that meet. These are the folks that I always call on to present on their case studies or best practices to the overall industry, but also to each other, really a learning environment. And we also have local technical assistance. So we convene the public and private sector at the local level through technical assistance panels to really figure out how to overcome barriers to decarbonization, really, at home, in your region, in your locality, and accelerate real estate's journey to net zero one by one. I use this slide quite a bit. We define net zero at ULI as a building portfolio that is highly efficient and fully powered by on-site and off-site renewable energy sources and offsets. And we see our journey to net zero in this series of bubbles. Now, it is a linear representation of the journey, but a lot of times I like to say we should flip it around and put it into a circle. With number one being energy efficiency. This is your on-site systems, on-site tech to really make sure that your building and your portfolio is operating with the least amount of power as possible. So really decreasing the demand on the energy grid. Number two is on-site renewables. So including solar, geothermal, on-site if you have room or the capacity. And if you don't, we move to number three, which is green interactivity and electrification. So electrifying as much as possible, and then also working with the utility to procure as much green power as possible. Number four is if you have done your best with your energy efficiency, your on-site renewables, and working with the utility grid, there's also the potential for offsetting the remainder of your power with RECs or other types of renewable offsets. And then the bubbles on the end are some of the ones we're going to talk about today. So tenant alignment, so owners and tenants working together on their ESG goals, and then embodied carbon. And that's when I like to swing all the way back to the front. So embodied carbon is the carbon associated with the transportation, the manufacture of building materials, and actually constructing the building itself. So reducing embodied carbon at the very beginning of your project, or when you have a retrofit opportunity or tenant fit out. So that also connects back to our tenant and owner alignment. Today, we're really going to focus on tenant and owner alignment in the flight to net zero, so working together as one. But where are we now? So I think that most people have come to understand that building operations and building materials and construction amounts to almost 40% of global carbon emissions. In urban cities, like many of us reside, that can be up to 70% of emissions in urban cities. So that is those our buildings that we live in and that we work in are contributing to quite a bit of our global carbon emissions. And when you think about owner spaces and tenant spaces can account for well over 50% of total energy consumption in your commercial buildings. So a lot of times you have buildings that are owner operated, but very often you have buildings that are owned by one entity, but then there are tenant spaces, maybe one large tenant or multiple tenants that add up to quite a bit of energy use. So when you're looking at your overall whole building energy use, you have to look at the common spaces that the owner is responsible for, but also those tenant spaces. And if you don't have a connection with your tenants, it's really difficult to get all those numbers together in one spot. So that really tells us that both owners and tenants share the goal of reducing their carbon emissions. And a lot of times, both entities have taken action to do so. They have their separate ESG goals. They have their separate sustainability goals. And working together is really important to make sure they're on the same path and taking advantage of the same opportunities and the same technologies within the building. Something else to take note of is the split incentive. So this is the lease structure, which sometimes can disincentivize one party from investing in sustainability upgrades. So an example of that would be if an owner puts solar on the roof and much of the building is powered, or a partial part of the building energy is powered by solar energy, but the tenants don't get to take advantage of that because they are still paying a lease rate, or within their lease structure, the same amount, regardless if it's renewable energy that's powered, by solar or not. So the party that pays the upfront cost of an efficiency improvement sometimes can be different from the one that benefits from future energy savings. On the flip side of that, if a owner pays for an energy efficiency upgrade in a tenant space, like maybe a controllable thermostat, and the tenant can either choose to use it the way it's meant to be or not use it. There really needs to be that connection to make sure that the owner investment is being used in the most efficiently and effectively way possible to really realize those energy use and energy savings. So this really shows us that to achieve whole building reductions in carbon emissions, property owners and tenants have to work together, sometimes in new and creative ways, and we'll go through those right now, what those opportunities are. This is really our takeoff, co-pilots in the cockpit, the business case for owner-tenant engagement and sustainability. And those opportunities, we really focus on 5 main strategies. At ULI, we are putting together a series of tenant primers based on these 5 strategies. The first one is green leasing. That has already been published. Data sharing has already been published. We are currently about to publish tenant fit outs, and then to be published are behavior change and renewables. So we are still looking for examples of those final 2 strategies. But let's jump into a few examples of what green leasing means and how that is a tenant owner collaborative strategy. So anytime a tenant or an owner goes into a leasing agreement, there obviously are a set of legal strategies and legal terms that are required by both parties. Green leasing or net zero leasing really means the inclusion of specific statements or strategies in the lease at the get-go that states who is going to be sharing data, what data is available, any other types of green leasing strategies or statements that the owner is requiring for the tenants or that the tenant wants from the owner. Maybe a tenant wants to see whole building energy use so they know how big or little their impact is in the overall whole building strategy. And as for an owner, if you have an owner that has multiple leases in a building and you want your whole building energy use, you need to make sure each tenant is on board with sharing that. There are also options for clauses around metering. Who has access to the metering? Is it scrub data? Is it not scrub data? So green leasing is really a great opportunity at the very start of a relationship to make sure everything is on the table and that both owner and tenant are getting what they want out of the ESG and sustainability measures of the lease. There's also another opportunity when there are longer term leases and they're up for renewal, adding those specific clauses into your lease and saying, here, this is a specific statement we are now adding into your lease for the next turnaround that we want you to share data in a specific way or give us access to data. And usually data is the number one piece in a green lease agreement. Data sharing is the next strategy, and that is so extremely important for any type of ESG strategy. It seems very simple, and I talk to a lot of former clients and current members about data sharing. We know that energy use data exists somewhere. There is a bill somewhere that is being paid, so we know those numbers exist, but they're not always stored in the same place, and they're not always shared in the same way. So for a building owner that wants whole building energy use, so again, the common area of the building and also the specific leased tenant spaces, having a whole picture of the data is really important. You have your common area data might come directly to the owner via a utility bill, but then depending on the lease structure, each tenant may have their own bill coming from the utility. They may pay the owner via another strategy and never see the utility bill. But it's really important to have the ability to share data and have it in the same method. I've seen cases where a tenant says, well, yeah, I have my data. Here's a pile of PDF of our bills from the last 15 years. But then that's not really an effective or efficient way to get data into a method to track and improve upon energy use and reducing carbon. So having owners and tenants talk to each other about data sharing, what they're willing to share. I think there's a lot of misconceptions around data sharing too, where tenants say, well, I don't want to get in trouble for using too much energy, or I don't want to share this because what we're doing in our space is private, proprietary. And there are certainly methods of making sure that data is scrubbed. So it's not specific to a meter, or it can just be instead of whole building, whole tenant space, so that both the tenant and the owner feel comfortable with what is being shared. But it really is important. The only way you can really improve energy use of a whole building is to have the baseline of the energy that building is using. And if you have big holes or big missing pieces of the puzzle, then it's really difficult to improve their overall whole building energy use. So this is the big important one. It seems simple, but it can also be complicated if all the parties aren't aware of the different methods of data sharing. So the next strategy is a fit out. So when I talk about fit outs, I'm talking about when a specific tenant space is turned over. So a lot of times in an owner occupied building, they fit out their space when they build the building and then they manage the property and run the property. But if you have multiple or even one tenant space within a larger building, each tenant has different interior fit outs, and that turnover is a good opportunity to really reduce carbon use and carbon emissions. We've seen some strategies where You look back at the original owner project requirements, you look back at what the tenant needs. Do you need to tear out all the walls and rebuild them each time you turn over a lease? It is unlikely you do. And what we've seen, there are some case studies that show when you show a potential new tenant a space, if you leave some of the fixtures or you leave some of the office interior design, they will end up choosing that space set out or reusing some of it, or not necessarily tearing down and rebuilding every piece of the structure. So instead of giving them a white box to look at, giving them some options of what the previous tenant used. So you're not just tossing all that stuff in the landfill, you can reuse it, you can reuse some of the structural pieces as well. So fit outs is a really good opportunity to make sure that you material-wise are being as efficient and effective as possible. So the next one is behavior change. And as I mentioned, at the Urban Land Institute, we are working on getting examples and case studies for this particular strategy, because this one's a tricky one. Behavior change is always tricky, and we're talking about making sure that everyone in the building is using, whether it's the interior fit out structures, materials, or the HVAC systems correctly. So I mentioned this earlier that say a owner renovates a space and uses programmable thermostats in all the tenant spaces. How do you then educate your tenants about how to properly use said programmable thermostat so that everyone isn't keeping them on all night long, or keeping the lights on, programmable lighting to make sure that folks don't have the lights on every day. I was driving late last night, back from an event with my family, and you still drive by office buildings to this day that have all the lights on in the middle of the night. So how do you make sure that those systems that an owner puts in, or even a tenant puts in, aren't being overridden by folks that say, well, it's too cold in here, I'm gonna, bypass the programmable thermostat and turn up the heat, and then forget to turn off the heat at the end of the day, or forget to, turn the override off and make sure all the lights go off. So behavior change can be tricky because you want tenants to be happy in their space and you want them to be efficient and effective in their working environment, but you also want to make sure that the building is being used in the most efficient way possible. So really the solution here is education. So anytime a tenant comes into a building, a new tenant or a new building user, you explain, these are the systems that have been incorporated. This is the best way to use them. If you have any questions, or if it's not working for you, have that open line of communication with the owner and the building user to make sure that the building is really just being used the best way possible. And again, we talked about tenant fit outs too, making sure that tenants understand where they can make changes and where they can reduce carbon emissions, and so that they can add that to their ESG goals as well. So it's not just talking about the owner's ESG goals, but maybe the tenants have multiple spaces within one building, or rent spaces from multiple buildings across the US, making sure all those ESG goals are being used effectively as well. If there are any ideas or case studies on behavior change, feel free to reach out to me. We are looking forward to incorporating those in our next tenant report primer. And the last strategy I wanted to talk about is renewables. So the most common one you see in large buildings is solar, like the image above, and how to best utilize that split incentive that I talked about earlier. So both the owner and the tenant takes advantage of renewable power being in a building. So if it is fully powered by renewables, does that then mean a tenant gets a reduced rent or does not have to pay utilities? Or again, if there are renewables on a building and a tenant is also reducing energy demand, do they get that payback somehow? So the renewable strategy is really making sure both the owner's investment in solar and also a tenant or building user's investment in behavior change or reducing demand all come together at the same point, so that an owner doesn't feel like, oh, I invested in solar but folks are still using a lot of energy. And now we don't have a net zero building because our tenants are using more energy than we anticipated. And we see that happen a lot in the building design and planning phase. You may utilize an energy model to predict how much energy your building might use. You say, well, based on similar buildings of similar use and similar size, our energy model puts out X amount of energy use, and we're going to cover our roof in the amount of solar to reach that. And then a couple months maybe into building occupancy, those numbers don't always add up right. So there need to be some tweaks either in the tenant's energy use and demand, how they utilize those systems, or explaining what the model assumptions were and trying to get that to even out. Because just because a building is modeled to be net zero doesn't mean in occupancy it's going to be quite as easy to make those numbers zero out. And again, if a building tenant is working on their own behavior strategies and building use, and they are not using as much energy as other tenants, do they get some sort of payback on their utility structure or utility lease? And these are all things that can be pushed back into, as I mentioned before, the leasing agreement. So thinking of all these strategies and then making sure they are all written down and agreed upon is really that number one step and very important. So with all those 5 strategies, and of course other strategies that I haven't mentioned that on the ground tenants and owners are figuring out together, we ideally want to arrive at our final destination, which is whole building decarbonization, not just decarbonizing the common areas that owners are responsible for, not just decarbonizing the specific tenant spaces, but looking at the whole building or the whole portfolio. It really is true that whole building decarbonization, unless you are an owner operator of your specific space, really cannot be achieved without owner and tenant collaboration. There are so many leased spaces out in commercial real estate and very limited owner occupied and managed buildings that tenant engagement and tenant alignment really has a strong business case. Measuring whole building emissions can help property owners and tenants better manage their building performance and meet those respective reporting requirements. So that's something I haven't quite touched on yet, that there are quite a few reporting requirements and guidelines that we see coming out in the media and the industry. And a lot of them do require whole building emissions. And sometimes you can estimate or guesstimate your tenant spaces, but that time it's trickier and trickier to estimate spaces you don't know. So getting that data and that connection is really important. And in some points, it might be required for reporting and beyond. And then sustainable assets that are working towards or maintaining net zero status can command higher financial and social value for owners and tenants. We are seeing more and more tenants looking for building spaces that have green leasing already set, that they have data sharing as part of their green lease, that they have data sharing as part of their requirements, that they promote their efficient building systems or the renewables on site to attract the type of tenant that's going to stay longer, that's going to have a better impact on the overall building, and that is going to be open to combining and aligning those ESG goals. And again, these tenants can also enhance those benefits to their employees. So it's not just building owners that get the benefit of longer term leases or less turnover from tenants, but tenants can say, well, hey, I want this better space or this more sustainable space for my employees. So they have these building amenities, they have better daylighting, they have green spaces, they have programmable thermostats or better controls or better indoor air quality for their employees to stay longer, work more efficiently, and have a better community overall. And that really brings it to the end. Tenant and owner alignment and collaboration is really important in the real estate industry. We see so much in terms of ESG goals and ESG strategies. And a lot of times that happens within each entity's corporate bubble, going back to our bubble and journey to net zero, but really those bubbles should intersect, and owners and tenants need to collaborate, talk to each other, and figure out how they can work on that ESG journey together and hit that final destination of whole building decarbonization. My email is up here. If anyone has any questions, suggestions for those upcoming primers, or comments, feel free to reach out.
Awesome job, Kara. Thank you so much. Do have a couple of quick follow-up questions for you.
Yeah.
As you're aware, our industry suffers from being the least digitized, declining in productivity, and has a strong resistance to change. Aside from the split incentive issue, what would you say is probably the biggest barrier to adoption that you're seeing on your end?
The biggest barrier to adoption, I think it's getting, it's interesting. The biggest barrier to adoption for tenant and owner alignment is really not knowing who to talk to and who to prioritize. So you see, a building owner's focus is getting leased up, right? We just need to get all the spaces leased up. That's the priority. Or a tenant is, we want to get the lowest, dollar per square foot. So a lot of times you'll see ESG or sustainability just fall lower and lower down on that list. So I think it's really the education piece of, no, these things that you talk about right at the get-go in terms of your leasing, talk about it now so you can build a better communication and alignment for the future. So I really think it's education and knowing that you can put this at the top and still get that low number, still get leased up just as quickly, or if not, better or faster.
Got it. Great. Last question. I know that ULI has been working on the tenant energy optimization program for, I guess, close to a decade now. What would you say are some lessons learned over the last 8, 7, 10 years from dealing with building owners and tenants?
I would say that there's always something new and exciting coming out, whether it's new tech, whether it's a new tenant, whether it's a new building, but really going back to the basics is very important. So making sure your building itself is running efficiently and effectively, right? That everyone knows how to use the systems in your building. A good example from a few years ago is a multifamily building where they, again, and I talk about programmable thermostats a lot because it really can have a big impact on the energy use, how you heat and cool your building. So they renovated the multifamily site with new programmable thermostats, and they realized that the folks in the buildings didn't know how to use them. They had given out guides, but there was a big language barrier that not everyone spoke the language on the guide. So they actually had to go around and make sure that they surveyed and figured out, what language was spoken in the unit or the apartment, and that they had the appropriate education tools that people could use the system. And it's such a simple thing that you really need to go back to the basics. It's not always the new technology. It's not always the newest or greatest tenant. It's really make sure your building's running well, make sure people who are in the building know how to run it, and start there.
Great point. Great way to end today's session. Thank you so much for your subject matter expertise and thought leadership. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.